so my experience was as a beat reporter for the Wall Street Journal for years, and what I have seen is that the beat structure of traditional news organizations, the way it's often defined, is a problem in exactly the way you described. So you have your Wall Street reporter, you have your DC Federal Reserve reporter, you have your Brussels reporter, you have someone covering the central bank in Japan. In an ideal scenario, they would share information perfectly and write this like beautiful macro, complete global picture. But the ideal scenario doesn't happen very often, and just as frequently, their bureau chiefs are fighting with each other over whose turf it is when any issue falls in between those.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. But I do think even the more established news organizations are trying to adjust their structures to account for that.
Right. And to George's point, that's one of the difficulties. I mean, and we're talking about an area in which it's particularly acute, I think, which is global finance, because after all, something that's happening in the Chinese economy, does it go? I mean, it might go on page one, or it might not. But is it a business story that goes in the business section? If you're talking about not even a sort of a financial newspaper, but a place like the Times, or a sort of mainstream news organization, is it an international story the same way that a story about some festival that's happening in the country at a given moment by the same writer, written kind of the same way? Is it sort of a curiosity, a bit of news tourism? Is it a story about finance that goes in the business section? Is it a politics story, and does it end up in the World Report or whatever it's called? In other words, and all of these, it seems almost like the story can only be one of them, and whichever one it is going to determine the level of depth that you get in different parts of the story.
Well, I mean, maybe in the New York Times, with that kind of section thing. But that's not the case in any of our organizations.
Right. Yeah.
We'll write that story the same way, and then we don't care what section it appears in.
Right. Sure.
But we do. I mean, just speaking from my experience, I mean, sort of in answer to your point about the bureaucracy of legacy sort of structures. Like, for instance, at Bloomberg, we sort of started to take this thing where we'll have like sort of like a global note that's shared amongst, at least on my beat at least, where there comes to media. I'll be conversing with someone in London and Paris and even on occasion like Sydney about company X. And it'll be sort of this lengthy exchange about what they know and what all the different reporters within their respective bureaus know about company X. And then we'll sort of come to some conclusion, well, what's the significance around this? And it may never yield a story, but at least we're having that conversation to sort of see the bigger picture, see what's the bigger story beyond just what happened in this town. I mean, there's this tendency towards all news is local. And when someone, the Berlin bureau chief or whomever it might be at the New York Times or whatever news organization, they're fighting for that story, but they're always their perspective is, here's how we're seeing it. And then there's like the top editors like, well, what's the global significance of that? And oftentimes you can't bridge that gap. But that conversation is at least happening.
One thing which the crisis did do, and this is fantastic, is it really did help to break down it wasn't even a wall. It was more of just a constant sniping and mutual mistrust that existed in virtually all news organizations between the New York and Washington bureaus. New York and Washington always hate each other. And what happened in the crisis was that they realized that they were covering the same story, and they had to stop fighting with each other because otherwise you just couldn't cover the story right.